The rain fell relentlessly on Meredith Gibson's bonnet as she stood alone at the Fort Stanton depot, clutching her small valise with trembling fingers. April 1878 was proving to be wetter than she'd imagined in New Mexico territory, and the letter in her pocket, now damp and wrinkled, offered little comfort. Had he changed his mind? 3 months of correspondence with Daniel Sterling had led her here, across half a continent, to marry a man she'd never met. Now, as twilight descended and the last passengers dispersed, Meredith's hope dwindled with each passing minute. Water streamed down her face, mingling with tears she could no longer contain. The weight of her decision pressed down harder than her sodden traveling dress. She had left everything behind in Philadelphia, a respectable but loveless life as a seamstress with no future beyond spinsterhood at 23. Daniel's advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper had promised something different. A life with purpose on a cattle ranch, a partner who needed her strength as much as her domestic abilities. Through the curtain of rain, she barely registered the approaching figure on horseback, tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with purpose. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, securing his horse before approaching her with long strides. His face remained shadowed beneath his wide-brimmed hat as he stopped before her. "Miss Gibson?" His voice was deep, tinged with uncertainty. She nodded mutely, unable to find her voice as rain continued to soak them both. With gentle fingers, he lifted her chin, his blue eyes finally meeting hers. "I waited," Daniel Sterling said simply, his expression softening. "I'm sorry I'm late. There was trouble at the North Pasture." The world seemed to pause between them as his calloused hand remained at her chin, steady and warm despite the chill of the rain. "I thought perhaps you'd reconsidered," Meredith whispered. "Not for a moment," he answered, then glanced at her drenched figure. "Let's get you somewhere dry." Daniel gathered her valise and offered his arm. The strength in it reassured her as he led her toward his wagon, covered with oilcloth to keep out the worst of the rain. As he helped her climb aboard, Meredith couldn't help but study his face in the fading light weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested both hardship and laughter. He wasn't the polished gentleman some might have hoped for, but there was something honest in his gaze that stirred her courage. "It's about an hour to the ranch," he explained, securing her bag and climbing up beside her. "The road gets rough when it rains like this." Daniel draped a heavy blanket around her shoulders before taking the reins. The simple gesture of kindness nearly undid her composure again. "I'm afraid I don't make a very good first impression," she said, attempting to wring water from her sleeve. A hint of a smile crossed his face. "Miss Gibson, you made it through a 3-day journey across country to marry a stranger. I'd say that makes quite an impression." As the wagon pulled away from the depot, Fort Stanton's modest collection of buildings receded behind them. The military fort that gave the settlement its name stood upon the hillside, its walls promising protection to the scattered homesteads and businesses that had grown around it in the decade since the Apache Wars had settled. "The town isn't much," Daniel said, noticing her gaze. "But it serves well enough. We come in for supplies once a month, more if necessary." Meredith asked. "My foreman Miguel and I, mostly. Sometimes I send one of the hands if there's too much work at the ranch." He glanced at her. "The Sterling place is 15 miles out. Good water, decent grazing. My father staked the claim 12 years ago." Meredith absorbed this information, trying to imagine the life ahead of her. "Your letters mentioned your father passed on," Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. 2 years back, took sick in winter. Doctor couldn't do much by the time we got him to town." His hands flexed on the reins. "My mother had already gone 5 years before that." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It's the way of things out here," he replied, though his tone suggested he hadn't fully accepted that truth. After a moment he asked, "Your letters didn't speak much of your family." Meredith looked down at her hands. "There isn't much to tell. My parents died of influenza when I was 16. I had an aunt who took me in, but she passed last year." She hesitated. "I've been on my own since then, working as a seamstress." Daniel seemed to consider this. Seems we're both alone then. Not anymore, Meredith said, the words escaping before she could weigh them. His eyes met hers briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, tentative, questioning, but not unwelcome. The rain began to slacken as they traveled, giving way to a misty dusk that revealed the landscape around them. Unlike the lush Pennsylvania countryside Meredith had known, this land was stark, with scattered juniper and piñon trees dotting the slopes of distant mountains. Yet there was a wild beauty to it, untamed and honest, like the man beside her. "The ranch is just beyond that ridge," Daniel said after they'd been traveling for some time. "It's not fancy, but it's solid. 4 bedrooms in the main house, good barn, corral for the horses." Meredith nodded, realizing how little she actually knew about the practicalities of her new life. Her imagination had filled in the gaps left by their correspondence, creating images that now seemed naive. "Mr. Sterling, Daniel," he corrected gently. "Daniel," she amended. "I should tell you that while I'm handy with a needle and can cook well enough, I've never lived on a ranch before." He seemed to consider this. "I didn't expect you had, but you wrote that you were willing to learn, and that's what matters out here. And you still want to go through with this?" she asked, needing the reassurance. Daniel slowed the wagon as they crested a hill, revealing a valley below where a cluster of buildings nestled against the backdrop of mountains. Lamplight glowed from the windows of the largest structure. "Miss Gibson Meredith," he said, turning to face her fully. "I advertised for a wife because running a ranch alone isn't just difficult, it's nearly impossible. But I didn't just want a worker, I wanted a partner." His eyes held her steadily. "Your letters showed me someone thoughtful and determined, someone who knows hardship but hasn't been broken by it." He paused. "If you've changed your mind, I'll take you back to Fort Stanton tomorrow, no questions asked. But if you haven't, I'd be honored to make this work." The simple sincerity in his words touched something deep within her. This wasn't romance as the novels described it, but perhaps it was something more enduring, a foundation upon which something true could be built. "I haven't changed my mind," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since her arrival. Relief visibly crossed his features. "Good," he said, taking up the reins again. "Let's go home then." As they approached the ranch, Meredith could make out more details: a sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals containing horses that raised their heads at the wagon's approach. A dog's bark announced their arrival, and a figure emerged from one of the outbuildings, waving in greeting. "That's Miguel," Daniel explained. "Been with the ranch since my father's time. His wife, Elena, helps in the house when needed, though they live in town now." The wagon pulled up before the main house, and Daniel set the brake before coming around to help her down. Her legs felt stiff after the journey, and she was grateful for his steadying hand. "Senor Daniel," Miguel called as he approached, a broad smile on his weathered face. "The señorita has arrived." He removed his hat respectfully as he reached them. "Welcome to Rancho Sterling, miss. I am Miguel Vasquez." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Vasquez," Meredith replied. "I'm Meredith Gibson, soon to be Sterling," Daniel added with a questioning glance at Meredith. She nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "Yes, soon to be Sterling." "Elena has prepared supper," Miguel said. "She said the señorita would be hungry after her journey." "That was very kind," Meredith said, touched by the thoughtfulness of people she hadn't yet met. "We'll be in directly," Daniel told Miguel, who nodded and headed back toward the barn. Left alone with Daniel again, Meredith suddenly felt the awkwardness of their situation. What came next? What was expected of her tonight? Daniel seemed to sense her unease. "I've prepared the 2nd bedroom for you," he said. "The wedding can wait until you're ready. Reverend Parker comes through every few weeks, or we can ride into Fort Stanton if you prefer not to wait." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you," she said. "I would like some time to settle in if that's acceptable." "Of course," he replied. "This is a partnership, Meredith. We make decisions together." He offered his arm again, and she took it as they walked toward the house. The porch light illuminated the entrance, welcoming and warm against the damp evening. "It might not be what you're used to," Daniel said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice as he opened the door. Meredith stepped inside to find a surprisingly comfortable home. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a dining table large enough for 8, and several well-worn but sturdy chairs. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that suggested Daniel was more well-read than she might have guessed. The floors were wooden planks, softened here and there by woven rugs. Simple curtains framed the windows. "It's lovely," she said honestly, taking it all in. A middle-aged woman emerged from what Meredith presumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ah, you have arrived," she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "I am Alina Vasquez. Come, come, you must be chilled to the bone." Before Meredith could respond, Alina had bustled her toward the fire, removing her wet bonnet and cloak with efficient movements. "Dios mío, you are soaked through." "Daniel, take her trunk upstairs while I help her change. Supper is nearly ready." She turned back to Meredith. "I have heated water for a bath in your room, not much, but enough to warm you." Overwhelmed by the kindness, Meredith could only nod gratefully as Alina led her upstairs to a bedroom that, while simple, had been prepared with obvious care. Fresh linens covered the bed, a small vase of wildflowers sat on the dresser, and a copper tub had been placed near the small fireplace where a fire crackled cheerfully. "I will help you out of these wet things," Alina said, already working on the buttons of Meredith's dress. No protests." "You will catch your death, and then what would become of our Daniel? 2 years he has been alone, working himself to exhaustion." As Alina helped her change and settle into the blessed warmth of the bath, Meredith found herself subjected to a gentle but thorough interrogation about her background, skills, and intentions regarding Daniel. There was a protective fierceness in the older woman's manner that spoke of deep affection for the ranch owner. "He is a good man," Alina said as she laid out one of Meredith's dresses, thankfully still dry inside the valise. "Not like some, he treats his workers fair, never raises a hand in anger." "His father was the same." She paused, studying Meredith. "The ranch needs a woman's touch, and he needs someone to remind him there is more to life than cattle and horses." "I hope I can be what he needs," Meredith said honestly. Alina's expression softened. "You came all this way, no?" "That shows courage, the rest will come." She helped Meredith dress, then stepped back with a satisfied nod. "Now you look like a bride, not a drowned kitten. Come, the men will be hungry." Downstairs, Daniel and Miguel were deep in conversation about a broken fence line when the women entered. Daniel stood immediately, his eyes widening slightly at the transformation a dry dress and pinned-up hair had wrought in his bride-to-be. "Better?" Meredith asked, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "Much," he replied, then seemed to catch himself. "That is, you look very nice, Miss Gibson." Alina and Miguel exchanged knowing glances as they all sat down to a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches. The conversation flowed more easily than Meredith had expected, with Miguel and Alina sharing stories about the ranch's early days, and Daniel occasionally adding details. Though he wasn't talkative, Daniel's quiet attention to her comfort refilling her cup, ensuring she had enough bread spoke volumes about his character. After the meal, Miguel and Alina prepared to leave, despite the late hour and lingering rain. "You're welcome to stay in the bunkhouse," Daniel offered, but Miguel shook his head. "The boys will be rowdy tonight, celebrating Miss Gibson's arrival. Better for an old man to sleep in his own bed. We will return in the morning." He winked at Meredith. "Perhaps the señorita would like to see the new calves tomorrow." Once they'd gone, an awkward silence fell between Daniel and Meredith. Alone for the first time in their new reality, neither seemed certain how to proceed. "Would you like to sit by the fire?" Daniel finally asked. "Or if you're tired from your journey, the fire would be nice," Meredith said, relieved to delay the moment when she would retreat to her solitary room. They settled into chairs near the hearth, the crackling flames the only sound for several minutes. Meredith studied Daniel's profile in the firelight's strong jaw covered with a neatly trimmed beard, straight nose, brow furrowed slightly in thought. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, breaking the silence. "In your letters, you mentioned cattle but little else." Daniel seemed grateful for the prompt. We run about 400 head of cattle, mostly Herefords crossed with Longhorns, sturdier that way for the winters. Got 20 horses, quarter horses mostly, good for working cattle. The ranch is about 8,000 acres, though only a portion is good grazing land. As he spoke about the land, his voice grew more animated, his hands gesturing to emphasize points about water rights, grazing rotation, and breeding stock. Meredith found herself drawn in by his obvious knowledge and passion. "And the men who work for you?" she asked when he paused, 5 full-time hands more during roundup and branding. "Good men, most been with us for years." He hesitated. "They'll be respectful to you, I've made that clear." "I'm sure they will be," she assured him. Touched by his concern, Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Meredith, I want to be honest with you. Ranching isn't an easy life, especially for a woman used to city comforts. The work is hard, the days are long, and luxuries are few." "I didn't come expecting luxury," she replied. "I came for a chance at a real life, not just existence." He studied her, as if assessing the truth of her words. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" Truly, Meredith considered deflecting, but decided honesty was the foundation they needed. "Because I was alone, with few prospects beyond a lifetime of sewing other women's wedding dresses." She met his gaze steadily. "And because your letters didn't promise romance or riches, just partnership and respect. That seemed more valuable than flowery promises that might wilt at the first hardship." Daniel's expression softened. "My father always said that out here, a marriage needs to be built on stronger stuff than just feelings. Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. Daniel stared into the fire. "Though I think he and my mother had more than just practicality between them, especially at the end." "And what do you want, Daniel?" Meredith asked quietly. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I want what they had, partnership first, yes, but also—" He struggled for words. "Also something that makes the work worthwhile." The vulnerability in his admission touched her deeply. "I want that too," she whispered. Something shifted between them in that moment, not love, not yet, but a seed of possibility planted in fertile ground. The fire had burned low when Daniel finally stood. "Dawn comes early here, you should rest." He hesitated. "Is there anything else you need tonight?" Meredith shook her head, rising from her chair. "You've already provided more than I expected." He walked her to the stairs, pausing at the bottom. "Good night, Meredith Gibson. I'm glad you came." "As am I, Daniel Sterling," she replied, meaning it more than she had thought possible just hours before. That night, lying in her new bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind around the eaves, the occasional creak of the house settling, Meredith felt a cautious hope unfurling within her. This place was nothing like she had imagined, and Daniel Sterling was no fairy tale prince. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could build something real together. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through curtains Meredith had forgotten to close. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place where she was. Then memory rushed back. Fort Stanton, the rain, Daniel's steady gaze as he said, "I waited." She dressed quickly in a practical blue dress, pinning her hair in a simple style before making her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but coffee bubbled on the stove, and a note in a strong, angular hand sat on the table, gone to check the south pasture. "Back by midday. Help yourself to anything you need." Meredith explored the kitchen, finding bread, preserves, and eggs. She was frying bacon when Alina arrived, looking surprised to find Meredith already at work. "Ah, you are an early riser. Good, good. A ranch wife must be." She set down a basket covered with a cloth. "I have brought fresh tortillas and some of my mother's chili sauce." The men, they work better with full stomachs. Together, they prepared a substantial breakfast, Alina showing Meredith where various supplies were kept and explaining the rhythm of meals on the ranch. Meredith listened attentively, storing away information about which hands preferred coffee sweet, which ones needed extra portions, and when the busiest meal times occurred. "During roundup, we feed them in shifts," Alina explained. "Sometimes 20 men or more. But for now, just the regular hands, plus you and Daniel." The bunkhouse crew arrived first, 5 men of varying ages who removed their hats and introduced themselves with awkward formality. They were clearly curious about her, but restrained their questions to polite inquiries about her journey while they ate with hearty appetite. Meredith found herself warming to them as they shared stories between bites: Will's tale of a mountain lion encounter, old Peterson's complaints about his rheumatism, young Jamie's shy mention of a girl he'd met in town. They were rough men, certainly, with weather-beaten faces and calloused hands, but there was a surprising gentleness in how they included her in their conversation. "Boss said you're from Philadelphia," Will said, accepting a coffee refill. "Must be quite a change." "It is," Meredith acknowledged, "but sometimes change is necessary." "Necessary for the boss, that's certain," Peterson chuckled. "Man can't cook worth a damn. Pardon my language, madam." The others laughed, though Jamie quickly added, "He's a good boss, though, fair. Doesn't ask anything of us he wouldn't do himself." Meredith noted how they all nodded at this, respect evident in their expressions. It spoke well of Daniel that his men viewed him this way. After the hands departed for their day's work, Alina guided Meredith through a tour of the house, explaining its quirks and needs: which windows stuck, where the roof leaked during heavy rains, which floorboards creaked. The house was solid but showed signs of having been without a woman's attention for some time. "Daniel, he tries," Alina said, opening a linen closet with haphazardly folded sheets, "but a man does not see these things the same way." By mid-morning, they had worked together to bring order to the kitchen and pantry, with Alina providing a running commentary on the challenges of keeping a ranch house: everything from battling mice in the flour bins to preserving enough food for winter. "You sew, yes?" Alina asked as they worked. When Meredith nodded, she continued, "Good. The men always need mending, and Daniel's shirts." She rolled her eyes expressively. "Perhaps now he will not look like a scarecrow on Sundays." Meredith laughed, finding Alina's forthright manner refreshing after the veiled conversations of Philadelphia society. "I'll do my best, though I suspect Daniel has other priorities than his appearance." "Men always do," Alina agreed sagely, "but a woman can improve things slowly, little by little. My Miguel was wild as a Mustang when I met him. Now he wipes his boots before entering the house. Usually." They were hanging fresh curtains in the parlor when the sound of hoofbeats announced Daniel's return. Meredith felt a flutter of unexpected anticipation as she moved to the window, watching as he dismounted with the easy grace she'd noticed the day before. "Your husband returns," Alina said with a knowing smile. "I will check on the stew for midday meal." Daniel entered, removing his hat and stopping short at the sight of the transformed room. His eyes traveled from the gleaming furniture to the fresh curtains before finally settling on Meredith. "You've been busy," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Alina has been teaching me the ways of a ranch house," Meredith replied. "I hope you don't mind the changes." "Mind," he looked around again. "It hasn't looked this good since my mother was alive." The simple compliment warmed her. "How was the south pasture, good grass coming in?" "Another few weeks and it'll be ready for the herd." He seemed pleased she had asked. "The men said you fed them well this morning." "They were very kind," she said. "I appreciate how welcoming everyone has been." Daniel nodded, then seemed to remember something. "I brought you this," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He withdrew a small, cloth-wrapped bundle and handed it to her. Curious, Meredith unwrapped it to find a carved wooden box, its lid inlaid with a pattern of stars. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "My father made it for my mother when they first came here," Daniel explained, a touch of awkwardness in his manner. "I thought you might like it for your things." The gift, both the object itself and the sentiment behind it, touched Meredith deeply. This wasn't just any trinket, but a piece of family history being shared with her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." Something passed between them then, a moment of connection that transcended their practical arrangement. Daniel's eyes, blue as the New Mexico sky, held hers with an expression she couldn't quite name, but that stirred something within her nonetheless. The moment was broken by Alina's announcement that the midday meal was ready. As they joined the ranch hands at the long table, Meredith found herself studying Daniel when he wasn't looking the way he listened attentively to concerns about a sick calf. How he remembered to ask Jamie about his mother's health, the respect with which he treated Miguel's opinion on rotating the grazing fields. This was a man who carried responsibility without resentment, who led without needing to dominate. It was, Meredith reflected, a rare quality in the men she had known. After the meal, Daniel asked if she would like to see more of the ranch. "Weather's fair today," he said. "Thought you might want to get your bearings." "I'd like that," she replied, pleased at the prospect of time alone with him. Elena insisted on lending Meredith a riding skirt, clicking her tongue disapprovingly at Meredith's city clothes. "You cannot tour a ranch in that dress, Nina." The dust, the thorns, it would be ruined. Once properly attired, Meredith met Daniel at the stable where he was saddling 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a smaller, dappled mare. "This is Daisy," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "Gentlest horse on the place. Do you ride at all?" "A little," Meredith admitted. "My father kept a horse for his business and he taught me the basics before he passed." Daniel nodded approvingly. "We can start slow. Riding's essential out here. Distances are too great for walking." He helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, one she was careful not to show as she settled into the saddle. For the next few hours, Daniel guided her across his land, pointing out landmarks, explaining water sources, and sharing the history of how his father had built the ranch from nothing. Meredith found herself captivated not just by the wild beauty of the landscape, but by Daniel's evident love for it. "That ridge there," he said, pointing to a distant outcropping, "marks our northern boundary. Beyond that is Jenkins' land, though old man Jenkins is more interested in mining these days than ranching." "It's much larger than I imagined," Meredith said, taking in the expansive vista before them. Daniel nodded, pride evident in his expression. "My father started with just 500 acres, added more whenever he could, said a man's legacy was the land he left behind." He paused, looking toward the distant mountains. "I've added 2,000 acres since he passed, good water rights with it." "You've honored his memory well," Meredith observed. Daniel glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "I try to, though sometimes I wonder if it's enough, just maintaining what he built." "From what I've seen, you've done more than maintain it," Meredith said. "Your men respect you, the ranch is prosperous, and now you're thinking of the future." She hesitated, then added softly, "That's why I'm here, isn't it?" He held her gaze, the intensity of his expression making her breath catch. "Yes," he said simply, "that's why you're here." The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. This wasn't love, not yet, but it was purpose, and Meredith found unexpected comfort in that clarity. As the sun began its descent, Daniel led them back toward the ranch house, taking a path that wound through a stand of cottonwoods along a small creek. The light filtering through the leaves dappled the ground in patterns of gold and shadow. "My mother loved this spot," Daniel said as they rode side by side, said it reminded her of home in Kentucky. He pointed to a weathered bench beside the water. "My father built that for her so she could sit and sketch. She was quite talented." "Did you keep any of her drawings?" Meredith asked. Daniel nodded. "There's a portfolio in my study. I could show you sometime if you'd like." "I would," she replied, touched that he would share something so personal. When they reached the ranch, Daniel helped her dismount, his hands lingering slightly longer at her waist than strictly necessary. The moment was interrupted by young Jamie running toward them, hat in hand. "Mr. Sterling, Cougar got one of the new calves up in the north pasture. Peterson's tracking it now, but he says we ought to organize a hunt before nightfall." Daniel's expression hardened. "Tell the men to prepare. Rifles, ropes, lanterns. We leave in 20 minutes. Jamie nodded and dashed off toward the bunkhouse. "Will it be dangerous?" Meredith asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "Mountain lions usually avoid humans," Daniel replied, already leading the horses toward the stable. "But this one's gotten a taste for veal, can't have it preying on the herd." "Of course," she said, though a knot of worry formed in her stomach. "How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. Might be back by supper, might be after dark." He hesitated, then added, "Don't wait up." These hunts can take time. Meredith nodded, trying to hide her unease. This was the reality of ranch life: sudden dangers, men riding out to face them, women left to wait and wonder. She would have to grow accustomed to it. Daniel must have sensed her concern, for his expression softened. "We'll be careful. Miguel knows these mountains better than the cougars themselves." "Be safe," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment longer. "I will," he promised, then turned to prepare for the hunt. From the porch, Meredith watched as Daniel rode out with his men, rifles gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Alina joined her, wiping her hands on her apron. "The first time is the hardest," the older woman said, understanding in her eyes. "The waiting, but it gets easier." "Does it?" Meredith asked softly. Alina smiled, though there was a shadow in her expression. "No, I lie, it never gets easier, but you learn to live with the fear, to not let it consume you." She patted Meredith's arm. "Come, we will prepare a feast for their return. Men are always hungry after a hunt." Working alongside Alina in the kitchen provided welcome distraction. As they kneaded bread and stewed beef, Alina shared stories of her 30 years with Miguel, their courtship, their early struggles, the children they had raised, now grown with families of their own. "Marriage is not always romance," Alina said as she chopped onions. "Sometimes it is just standing together against whatever comes. The romance, it comes and goes like seasons, but the standing together, that must remain." "Is that why you've stayed so long in this harsh land?" Meredith asked. Alina looked up, her dark eyes wise. "I stay because this harsh land gave me Miguel, gave me children, gave me purpose. The land takes, yes, but it also gives." She pointed her knife at Meredith. "You will see, it will take from you comfort, ease, perhaps even more. But it will give back tenfold if you are patient." Night fell with no sign of the hunting party. Meredith tried to focus on mending one of Daniel's shirts that Alina had pointed out, but her attention kept straying to the window, searching the darkness for movement. "You should sleep," Alina said gently, "around 10 o'clock. The men may be out all night if the cougar is elusive." "I don't think I could sleep," Meredith admitted. Alina studied her, then nodded. "I will stay with you then. Miguel would not want me traveling back to town alone at night anyway." They sat together by the fire, Alina teaching Meredith to embroider in the Mexican style, while sharing more tales of the ranch's history: the harsh winter of '68 when they nearly lost the entire herd, the Apache raids in the early days, the gradual building of peace with their mescalero neighbors. It was well past midnight when the sound of horses brought both women to their feet. They rushed to the porch, lanterns held high as the hunting party returned. Daniel dismounted wearily, his clothes dusty and a streak of what looked like blood across his sleeve. Meredith's heart clenched at the sight. "Are you hurt?" she asked, hurrying down the steps. "Not mine," he assured her, nodding toward a horse that carried a large, tawny shape draped across its back. "Got him just before moonrise. He was a big one, probably been picking off calves for weeks." Relief flooded through Meredith, followed by embarrassment at how transparent her concern must have been. "I'm glad you're safe," she said, more formally. Daniel's tired expression softened as he looked at her. "You waited up." The echo of his words from their first meeting wasn't lost on her. "I waited," she confirmed quietly. Something shifted in his gaze, a realization, perhaps, or a decision. Without warning, he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers gentle despite their roughness. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. The moment stretched between them, fragile and promising, until Miguel's call for help with the horses broke the spell. Daniel stepped back, duty reclaiming his attention, but the warmth of his touch lingered on Meredith's skin. That night, as she finally sought her bed, Meredith reflected on how much had changed in just 2 days. The strange land was beginning to feel less foreign, the house less like someone else's home. And Daniel Sterling, the stranger she had agreed to marry, was becoming something else entirely, not quite familiar yet, but no longer unknown. She fell asleep with the memory of his fingers against her cheek, wondering what tomorrow might bring. The next week passed in a blur of new experiences as Meredith settled into life at the Sterling Ranch. Each day brought fresh challenges and small victories. as she learned the rhythm of ranch life from managing the household accounts to preserving early spring vegetables from Alina's garden. Daniel was often gone from dawn until dusk, busy with the constant demands of the cattle operation, but he made a point of spending time with her each evening. They would sit by the fire after supper, talking of their days, learning each other's histories in small, careful increments. She learned that he had been educated at a boarding school in Denver until he was 16, when his father's illness brought him home to the ranch permanently. He spoke 4 languages: English, Spanish, some Apache phrases learned from trading partners, and surprisingly, Latin from his schooling. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Philadelphia, her father's small printing business, her mother's love of music, the grief of losing them both within days of each other. She told him of the years with her aunt, learning to survive through practical skills rather than the ornamental education many young women received. "You're remarkably self-sufficient," Daniel observed one evening as she darned socks by lamplight. "Necessity is an effective teacher," she replied with a small smile, "though I'm finding ranch life requires an entirely new set of skills." "You're adapting well," he said, his tone warm with approval. "Alina says you've taken to baking bread like you were born to it," Meredith laughed. "Alina exaggerates. My first attempt was hard enough to use as a doorstop." Daniel's answering smile transformed his face, softening the lines of fatigue and worry. These moments when his serious demeanor gave way to genuine warmth had become precious to Meredith. Small treasures she collected in her heart. On Sunday, Meredith experienced her first taste of social life in the territory when Daniel took her to services in Fort Stanton. The small church was filled with ranchers, townspeople, and a scattering of soldiers from the fort itself. All eyes turned to them as they entered, or more specifically, to Meredith, the newcomer, the mail-order bride, Mrs. Jenkins, Daniel said, introducing Meredith to a stern-faced woman in a black bombazine dress. "May I present Miss Gibson? She'll soon be Mrs. Sterling." Mrs. Jenkins assessed Meredith with sharp eyes. "From back east, I understand." "Philadelphia," Meredith confirmed, maintaining a polite smile despite the woman's obvious scrutiny. You'll find things different here, rougher, less civilized." The last word carried a hint of challenge. "Different, certainly," Meredith agreed pleasantly. "But I've found the people remarkably kind." Daniel's hand at her elbow gave a small, approving squeeze. Mrs. Jenkins seemed about to say more when a young woman joined them, her face alight with genuine welcome. "Oh, you must be Daniel's bride. I'm Sarah Parker, the Reverend's daughter." She extended her hand warmly. "I'm so pleased to meet you. We've all been curious since Daniel placed that advertisement." Her friendly manner was a balm after Mrs. Jenkins' coolness. "It's lovely to meet you, Miss Parker. I'm Meredith Gibson. Please call me Sarah." "We don't stand on such formality here. There are too few of us for that." She linked her arm through Meredith's. "Come, let me introduce you to everyone before the service begins." With Sarah as her guide, Meredith met the small community that would become her social circle: the doctor and his wife, the general store owner, several neighboring ranchers and their families. Some, like Mrs. Jenkins, regarded her with suspicion, but most were welcoming, if curious about the Eastern woman who had traveled so far to marry Daniel Sterling. "Don't mind Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah whispered as they took their seats. She hoped Daniel would court her daughter Beatrice when he started looking for a wife, but Beatrice is barely 18 and Daniel is. "Well, Daniel." She glanced at the tall rancher who sat beside Meredith, his expression solemn as the service began. "He needs someone of substance, not a girl who faints at the sight of blood." The Reverend's sermon touched on themes of new beginnings and faith in God's plan, words that resonated with Meredith's current circumstances. When he announced that Mr. Sterling and his bride to be wished to be joined in matrimony next Sunday, a ripple of interest passed through the congregation. Daniel's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Is that acceptable?" he murmured, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "We can wait longer if you prefer." The consideration in his question touched her. "Next Sunday is perfect," she whispered back, and was rewarded with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. After the service, they joined several families for a picnic lunch on the church grounds. Meredith found herself drawn into conversations about household management in the territory, where to find the best fabric, how to preserve food through the harsh winters, which catalog companies delivered most reliably to such remote locations. "You'll want to order extra supplies before the autumn rains," advised Mrs. Thompson, the doctor's wife. "The roads can become impassable for weeks. And salt," added Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the boarding house. "Always keep extra salt for preserving. The supply wagons are not reliable." Meredith absorbed this practical advice gratefully, aware of how much she still had to learn. Across the picnic area, she could see Daniel deep in conversation with several men, likely discussing cattle prices or grazing rights. He glanced up, catching her eye, and gave a small nod that somehow conveyed both reassurance and pride. "He's different since you arrived," Sarah observed, following Meredith's gaze. "Less stern." "Is he?" Meredith asked, genuinely curious about how others perceived the change in Daniel. Sarah nodded decisively. "My father says a good woman brings out the best in a man. I think Daniel had forgotten how to be anything but the ranch owner until you came." The journey back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing the day's social interactions. As the wagon crested the final hill before home, Daniel broke the silence. "What did you think of our neighbors?" Meredith considered her answer carefully. "They seem like good people for the most part, resilient, practical." "And Mrs. Jenkins?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Disappointed in your choice of bride," Meredith replied with a small smile. "Though I suspect she'd have found fault with anyone you selected." Daniel chuckled, the sound rich and warm. "Probably true. She's had her eye on me for Beatrice since the girl turned 16. Never mind that Beatrice turns pale at the mention of calving season. While I'm made of sterner stuff," Meredith teased, his expression turned serious as he looked at her. "Yes," he said simply, "you are." The quiet conviction in his voice stirred something in Meredith's heart, a feeling that had been growing steadily over the past week, nurtured by small moments of connection and shared purpose. "Sarah mentioned the wedding next Sunday," she said after a moment. "Are you certain you don't want to wait longer? We've known each other only a week." Daniel guided the wagon into the ranch yard before answering. "I'm certain," he said, setting the brake. "Unless you have doubts." Meredith considered the question honestly. Did she have doubts? This wasn't the romantic courtship she had once dreamed of as a girl. Yet in the week since her arrival, she had discovered in Daniel qualities that ran deeper than surface charm: integrity, gentleness beneath his reserved exterior, and a steadfast dedication to those in his care. "No," she said finally. "No doubts, just awareness that we're still learning each other." Daniel helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Marriage is a lifetime of learning each other," he said, his blue eyes intent on hers. "At least, that's what my father always said." The week before the wedding passed in a flurry of preparation. Elena and several women from neighboring ranches descended on the Sterling house, helping Meredith ready her wedding dress, a blue silk she had brought from Philadelphia, now adorned with lace from Elena's own wedding gown. "Something borrowed," Elena said, carefully sewing the delicate lace to the bodice, "for luck and blessing." Sarah Parker contributed a small pearl hairpin, something new, though the pearls are old, from my grandmother's collection. Mrs. Thompson arrived with a length of ribbon the color of desert sunset. "To trim your bonnet," she explained. "Every bride should have something colorful on her wedding day, even in this dusty place." Meredith was touched by these gestures of acceptance from the community of women who would become her neighbors and friends. Their practical help and shared wisdom made the approaching ceremony feel less like a business arrangement and more like a true beginning. Daniel, for his part, spent the week ensuring the ranch would run smoothly during the 3 days he planned to be away after the wedding. "Just to Fort Sumner," he explained when Meredith asked about his plans. "There's a hotel there, nothing fancy but private. I thought you might appreciate getting away from the ranch briefly." The consideration behind his planning, creating a small honeymoon despite the demands of the ranch, spoke volumes about his character. Meredith found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, thoughtful man who expressed himself more through actions than words. The night before the wedding, after the last of the visiting women had departed, Meredith found Daniel on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Second thoughts?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. "No," she answered honestly. "Though I am a bit nervous, aren't you?" He considered this. "Not about marrying you," he said finally. "About being a good husband? Yes." He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the lamplight spilling from the window. "Meredith, I want you to know something before tomorrow. I may not be skilled at expressing feelings, but I respect you greatly. And I will do everything in my power to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me by coming here." The simple sincerity of his words moved her deeply. Impulsively, she reached out to take his hand. "I believe you will," she said softly, "and I make the same promise to you." Daniel's fingers tightened around hers, warm and strong. For a long moment they stood together in the quiet night, connected by more than their clasped hands by shared purpose, growing affection, and the promise of tomorrow. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the spring air filled with the scent of wildflowers. Meredith woke early, a flutter of anticipation in her stomach as she remembered. Today she would become Mrs. Daniel Sterling. Sarah and Alina arrived shortly after breakfast to help her prepare, bringing with them a bouquet of desert flowers tied with ribbon. "Wild roses and Indian paintbrush," Sarah explained. "The best New Mexico has to offer a bride." As they helped her into her wedding dress and arranged her hair, Meredith found herself thinking of her mother, wishing she could be present for this day. Perhaps she would have worried about her daughter marrying a man she barely knew in a land so far from home. Or perhaps she would have recognized, as Meredith was beginning to, that some connections defied conventional timelines. The small church was filled to capacity when they arrived. Meredith waited outside with Reverend Parker while Sarah slipped in to signal the beginning of the ceremony. "Nervous, my dear?" the kindly Reverend asked, patting her hand. "A little," she admitted. "It's all happened so quickly." He smiled, wisdom in his eyes. "I've found that time is rarely the most important factor in a successful marriage. Character is." He nodded toward the church door. "And Daniel Sterling has that in abundance." The simple words steadied her. When the door opened and the congregation rose, Meredith walked forward with confidence, her eyes finding Daniel where he stood at the altar. The look on his face as he saw her, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and pride, swept away any lingering doubts. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, traditional vows spoken with quiet conviction by both bride and groom. When Reverend Parker pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, but his eyes promised deeper connection to come. The celebration afterward was lively, with food contributed by every family in attendance. Daniel kept Meredith close by his side as they accepted congratulations, his hand often finding the small of her back in a protective, possessive gesture that sent warmth spreading through her. "Mrs. Sterling," he murmured during a quiet moment, "how does it sound?" "Unfamiliar," she admitted with a small smile, "but good." His answering smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way she had come to cherish. "Good," he echoed, his voice rich with satisfaction. They departed mid-afternoon, amid cheers and well wishes, for the 3-hour journey to Fort Sumner. As the ranch and then Fort Stanton receded behind them, a new awareness grew between them. They were truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. Conversation flowed more easily than Meredith had expected, perhaps because the formality of their courtship had been replaced by the certainty of their union. Daniel spoke of his plans for the ranch, his hopes for expanding the herd, perhaps adding sheep if the market remained strong. Meredith shared her ideas for the house, a vegetable garden, perhaps chickens, maybe even transforming the unused east bedroom into a proper library. "You like books?" Daniel asked, seeming pleased. "Very much," she replied. "I noticed your collection is quite extensive for a ranch house." My mother insisted on books, he explained. Said the mind needed cultivation as much as the land. My father built her new shelves every Christmas, a tradition worth continuing, Meredith suggested. His hand covered hers on the wagon seat. I think so too. Fort Sumner proved to be larger than Fort Stanton, with a proper hotel that catered to travelers along the Santa Fe Trail. Their room was simple but clean, with a real bed instead of a cot, and windows that looked out over the Pecos River. Dinner in the hotel dining room was the most formal meal Meredith had experienced since leaving Philadelphia. Tablecloths, proper silverware, and a waiter who called her Mrs. Sterling with respectful deference. Daniel had clearly arranged for their best accommodations, perhaps understanding that this interlude between her old life and new one needed marking with some ceremony. As they returned to their room, the reality of the night ahead settled over them both. The easy conversation of the journey faded into awkward silence as Daniel closed the door behind them. I can step out while you prepare for bed, he offered, his consideration evident despite the tension in his posture. Thank you, Meredith said softly, grateful for his understanding. Alone, she changed into the nightgown she had sewn especially for this night, modest by Eastern standards, but made of finer fabric than her usual practical cotton. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed out her hair and removed the pins that had held her wedding hairstyle in place. When Daniel returned, he had removed his coat and boots but was otherwise still dressed. He hesitated at the sight of her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You're beautiful," he said, the simple words carrying the weight of genuine appreciation. Meredith felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you." Daniel crossed to where she sat, then knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Meredith," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I want you to know that I don't take us lightly. What began as a practical arrangement has become more, at least for me." Her heart quickened at his admission. "For me as well," she whispered, his eyes searched hers. "I'm not a poetic man, words don't come easily to me, but I want to be a good husband to you in all ways." The vulnerability in his expression touched her deeply. This strong man, so capable in his world of cattle and land, was offering her his heart with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything. Meredith reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I believe you will be," she said softly. "As I hope to be a good wife to you." Daniel turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, the gesture unexpectedly intimate. Then he rose, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. Their first kiss as man and wife had been brief, public, almost formal. This one was different, tentative at first, then deepening as they found their way together. His hands were gentle as they framed her face, then slid into her hair, cradling her head as if she were precious. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Daniel's eyes had darkened with desire, but he made no move to rush what would come next. "We have time," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "All the time we need." The consideration in his words, his awareness that this was new territory for her, that trust needed to be built between them, confirmed what Meredith had begun to suspect. That in Daniel Sterling, she had found not just security or partnership, but the possibility of true love. What followed was a gentle discovery of each other, with Daniel letting Meredith set the pace of their intimacy. His patience and tenderness revealed a depth of caring that transcended the practical nature of their marriage's beginning. By the time they came together fully as husband and wife, Meredith felt not just desire but a profound connection to this man who had waited in the rain for her barely 2 weeks ago. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight spilled through the window, Meredith marveled at how quickly life could change, how a decision born of practicality could open the door to unexpected joy. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, his voice rumbling beneath her ear where it rested on his chest. "That I'm glad I answered your advertisement," she replied honestly. "That I'm glad you waited for me at the depot, even in the rain." His arm tightened around her. "I would have waited all night," he admitted, "when I saw you standing there looking so lost and yet so determined. I knew I'd found someone extraordinary." The simple confession warmed her through. Not so extraordinary, she demurred, just practical enough to recognize a good man when I met one. Daniel's chuckle vibrated against her cheek. We'll call it mutual good fortune then. They spent 3 days in Fort Sumner, a honeymoon that balanced privacy with practicality. During the days, they explored the small town, visited the abandoned military fort that had once housed Navajo and Mescalero Apache during a dark chapter of territorial history, and rode along the Pecos River where cottonwoods provided shade for picnic lunches. In the evenings, they returned to their hotel room to continue the intimate discovery of each other not just physically, though that aspect of their marriage flourished with surprising ease, but emotionally as well. Protected by darkness, they shared confidences that might have been harder in the light of day. Daniel's fears about living up to his father's legacy, Meredith's worries about adapting to ranch life, both of their hopes for children someday. By the time they began the journey back to the ranch, something fundamental had shifted between them. The practical partnership they had agreed to had been transformed into something deeper, a bond built on mutual respect, growing affection, and the intimate knowledge that comes from truly seeing another person. The ranch hands greeted their return with good-natured teasing and a welcome home dinner prepared by Alina. Watching Daniel laugh with his men, comfortable in his role as both boss and friend, Meredith felt a surge of pride in her husband and the life they were beginning together. That night, as they settled into what was now their shared bedroom, Daniel pulled her close against his side. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sterling," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Home," Meredith repeated, testing the word. It felt more right than she had expected after such a short time. "Yes, I believe it is." The following months saw Meredith truly settling into her role as mistress of Sterling Ranch. Under Alina's guidance, she learned the rhythms of ranch life, the busy periods of roundup and branding, the quieter winter months when survival itself became the primary occupation, the constant vigilance required to maintain a prosperous operation in such challenging territory. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher in all things related to the ranch. He taught her to ride properly, to understand the cattle business, even to shoot the rifle that hung above the fireplace just in case, he said, though his expression made it clear he hoped that case would never arise. In turn, Meredith brought order and comfort to the house that had been solely male domain for too long. She planted herbs and vegetables that thrived in the New Mexico soil, kept chickens that provided fresh eggs daily, and transformed the parlor into a true gathering place where Daniel and his men could relax after long days of work. More importantly, she brought companionship to a man who had been alone too long. Each evening, they shared the events of their day over supper, then often read together by the fire, Daniel's deep voice bringing life to passages from Shakespeare or Dickens. Sometimes he would play the fiddle that had been his grandfather's, filling the house with music that seemed to belong to the wild landscape around them. Their physical relationship deepened as well, passion and tenderness entwining as they learned each other's bodies and desires. Meredith discovered aspects of herself she hadn't known existed, a capacity for pleasure, a boldness in expressing her needs, a deep satisfaction in bringing joy to her husband. By the time autumn painted the cottonwoods gold along the creek, Meredith knew she was carrying their first child. She shared the news with Daniel one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and rose. "A baby," he whispered, his hand covering hers where it rested on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The wonder in his voice matched the awe in his eyes as he knelt before her, pressing his lips to her abdomen through her dress. "When, Dr. Thompson thinks late spring," Meredith replied, running her fingers through her husband's hair. "May, perhaps." "Perfect timing," Daniel said, smiling up at her, "after the worst weather before the summer heat." "You're pleased, then?" she asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. "Pleased." He rose to pull her into his arms. "Meredith, you've given me everything I never knew I wanted. A true home, partnership, love." He kissed her tenderly. "And now a child. Please doesn't begin to describe what I feel." As winter settled over the ranch, bringing shorter days and long nights by the fire, Meredith reflected on how completely her life had changed in less than a year. The lonely woman who had stood in the rain at Fort Stanton Depot seemed like someone from a different lifetime, a ghost replaced by this new Meredith Sterling, wife, expectant mother, respected member of the community. Daniel proved to be even more protective and attentive during her pregnancy, insisting she rest frequently, bringing her small gifts from his rides across the range, a particularly beautiful stone, wildflowers that bloomed even in winter, once even a tiny carved wooden horse for their child. "My father made toys for me," he explained as she admired the craftsmanship. "I want to continue that tradition." The ranch hands treated her with a mixture of protectiveness and awe, as if her pregnancy were some kind of miracle rather than the natural progression of marriage. Young Jamie was particularly solicitous, bringing her the first eggs each morning and insisting on carrying anything heavier than a cup of tea. "You'd think I was the first woman ever to have a baby," Meredith laughed to Alina during one of the older woman's visits. Alina smiled knowingly. "For these men, you might as well be. They have adopted you as their own, and now they will adopt your child as well. It is the way of the ranch we become family." This sense of extended family became even more apparent as Meredith's pregnancy progressed. Sarah Parker organized a baby gathering where the women of the community presented Meredith with handmade gifts for the coming child: blankets, tiny clothes, a cradle that Dr. Thompson had crafted from local pine. "It takes a community to raise a child out here, Mrs. Thompson explained as Meredith thanked them, tears in her eyes at their generosity. "We all look after each other's little ones." Even Mrs. Jenkins, who had initially been so cool toward Meredith, contributed a beautifully embroidered christening gown. "It was Beatrice's," she said gruffly. "No sense letting it sit in a trunk." As spring approached, bringing new calves to the pastures and the promise of her own child's arrival, Meredith felt a contentment she had never expected to find when she answered Daniel's advertisement. This harsh land had indeed taken from her the comforts of city life, proximity to all that was familiar, but it had given back abundantly in purpose, community, and love. The baby came in early May, just as the wildflowers were painting the hillsides in riots of color. Labor began at dawn, with Alina and Mrs. Thompson attending while Daniel paced the porch with Miguel and the ranch hands offering awkward but heartfelt support. By midday, the first cries of William James Sterling filled the bedroom, strong, indignant wails that brought his father rushing in to meet his son. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, tears unashamedly tracking down his cheeks as he took the swaddled infant from Alina's arms. "Meredith, he's absolutely perfect." Exhausted but radiant, Meredith watched as her husband cradled their son with careful hands that could break a wild horse, yet now trembled with the weight of new life. "He has your chin," she observed, smiling as Daniel brought the baby to her side. "And your eyes, I think." "Poor child," Daniel joked, though his gaze never left his son's face. "But your nose, definitely, thank goodness for that, Mrs. Thompson shooed him out after a few minutes, insisting that mother and child needed rest, but Daniel returned as soon as permitted, sitting beside the bed with wonder still etched on his features. "I never thought I could feel this way," he admitted, one finger gently tracing the curve of the baby's cheek. "When my father died, I thought I understood what it meant to love someone, but this—" He shook his head, words failing him. "I know," Meredith said softly, understanding perfectly what he couldn't articulate. The fierce, protective love that had surged through her at William's first cry had changed her fundamentally, expanding her heart in ways she hadn't known were possible. The days that followed were a blur of adjusting to new parenthood midnight feedings, learning to decipher different cries, the constant wonder of watching this tiny human who had emerged from their love. Daniel proved to be an attentive father, often walking the floor with William when he was fussy, singing old Kentucky ballads his mother had taught him, speaking to his son about the ranch as if the infant could understand every word. "He'll be a fine horseman," Daniel predicted as they sat on the porch one evening, William sleeping peacefully in Meredith's arms. And a good rancher. Though if he wants something else, doctor, lawyer, whatever calls to him, will find a way. He might want to be a poet, Meredith teased. Or a painter. Would you mind having an artistic son? Daniel considered this seriously. No, he decided. So long as he's true to himself and lives with integrity, he can be whatever he chooses. His eyes met hers. That's what my father told me, though it took me years to understand he meant it. As summer heat gave way to the cooler days of autumn, life settled into a new pattern with William at its center. The ranch continued to prosper under Daniel's management, with cattle prices strong and a bumper hay crop to see them through the winter. Meredith found unexpected fulfillment in motherhood, though she still maintained her involvement in ranch operations, keeping the accounts with William napping beside her desk, joining Daniel for rides to check the herd when Alina was available to watch the baby. Their partnership deepened with parenthood, each finding new facets to admire in the other. Daniel's infinite patience with a colicky infant, Meredith's ability to manage household and child while still supporting the ranch's needs. We make a good team, Mrs. Sterling, Daniel observed on their first wedding anniversary as they picnicked by the creek where his mother had once sketched. Better than I could have imagined, Meredith agreed, watching as he dangled a small, carved horse above William, who gurgled and reached for the toy with pudgy hands. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. When I placed that advertisement, I was looking for a practical solution to running the ranch. I never expected. He paused, searching for words. I never expected to find someone who would change everything: how I see the world, how I understand myself. Meredith reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar contours. Nor did I expect to find a man who would wait in the rain for a bedraggled stranger, then build her a life filled with purpose and love. Daniel caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, the gesture that had become their private symbol of affection. I would wait a lifetime in the rain for you, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. As William finally captured the wooden horse and promptly tried to eat it, they laughed together, husband and wife, father and mother, partners in the truest sense. From practical beginnings had grown a love as vast and enduring as the New Mexico sky above them, a love that would weather whatever storms life might bring. And many years later, when their grandchildren begged for the story of how grandmother and grandfather met, Meredith would always begin the same way. I stood in the rain at Fort Stanton Depot, thinking all was lost. Then a tall cowboy approached, lifted my chin with gentle fingers, and said 3 words that changed my life forever. I waited.